All right, welcome everyone. Hello, comrades. Welcome to another Socialist Action webcast. My name is Flo Sade, and I'll be chairing this evening. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, also known as North America. I myself am joining from the unceded territories of the Tsimshian peoples in northern BC in a place called Terrace. As socialists, we join the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is resisting the new McCarthyism in Canada. Long before October 7th, 2023, Canada's legal and institutional framework has shielded apartheid Israel and perpetuated Zionist ideology. Over the past year, the Canadian state has increasingly targeted pro-Palestinian activists and protesters against genocide, with charges and jail time, while finding underhanded ways to punish pro-Palestine speech through initiatives such as the Canadian Handbook on the IHRA working definition of antisemitism. The sharp rise in aggressive and anti-democratic tactics pursued by the state to crack down on free speech is a shameful intimidation campaign on behalf of a powerful proxy of empire. Tonight's discussion will examine what's happening, its political significance, and how we can fight back. Our guest speakers are Yves Engler, author of over a dozen books and founder of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and Aislin Jackson, co-author of a newly updated arrest handbook and a BC Civil Liberties Staff Council. Our speakers will present their views for up to 25 minutes each and then answer questions from the audience. So let's welcome our first speaker, Yves Engler. Yves is a Montreal-based activist and author who's published 12 books, including his latest Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. In recent years, Yves has sought to mobilize activists to confront politicians through peaceful direct action. He's interrupted about 24 speeches and press conferences by the Prime Minister, ministers, and opposition party leaders to question their militarism, anti-Palestinian positions, climate policies, and imperialism. Yves played an important role in the successful campaign to oppose Canada's bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, and he is founder of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. So, Yves, over to you. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Flo, and thanks to Socialist Action for inviting me for this event and for everyone for coming out. So basically, I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. Basically, I think most of us know what McCarthyism is. This attack against the left in the early 1950s in the U.S. There was sort of a parallel process in Canada. Part of what emboldened it was the success of Mao's forces in China in 1949, which prompted in part the U.S.-led invasion of Korea, which was this really horrible war that left millions and millions of people killed in the early 1950s. That's some of the context of this these attacks against the left in the U.S. And today's, let's call it new McCarthyism, what it is in response in Canada is to the popular uprising, really unprecedented in Canadian history, in terms of internationalism, against Canada's complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza, it's long-standing apartheid. Now, I'm not going to go into that. Obviously, it requires a whole talk. But quickly, early on, the statements of Canadian politicians, the Canadian defense jets or airplanes bringing Israeli soldiers back into Israel right after October 7th. Canada's Minister Jolie with multiple, what she called solidarity missions to Israel, intelligence assistance, rapidly increasing the pace of okaying arms permits. That's some of what we saw in the first few months of Israel's slaughter campaign in Gaza. And that's all part of a much longer, century-long Canadian support for Zionism, dispossession of Palestinians. Major elements of that today are things like the Canada-Israel trade agreement, the registered charities, where there's $400 million or so registered by subsidized Canadian charities sent to Israel every year, to all kinds of projects that support the Israeli military, West Bank settlements. You have Canadians fighting in the Israeli military, on and on and on. So Canada has this very deep historic, and when I get into more of that later on, if you want, and current support for this state that is committing obviously a genocide in Gaza, but also incredible levels of violence in Lebanon and Syria, Iraq, Yemen, really all across the region. And so there's a huge reaction, and there's been unprecedented level of protest and response over the past 16 months. Now, there's been, as part of our support for Israel and as part of the reaction to this unprecedented popular uprising, there's just been this wave of demonization of activists, of people protesting against genocide. There's been a whole slew of firings. Certainly, it's into the dozens. The one recently got some attention. Maybe hear more about that later. A former senior manager in BC Northern Health Authority was fired for her postings outside of work. You have things like the Vancouver Public Library banning their employees from wearing keffiyehs unless they can speak not just Arabic, but they can speak a Palestinian dialect of Arabic, so they can prove that this is like directly their cultural garment is the idea. You have remarkable levels, dozens, hundreds probably of talks being canceled all across the country at different levels of sort of official government departments. In one of the more outrageous examples, not long ago, McGill actually effectively banned the talk by UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese. So you have a UN Special Rapporteur, the student groups book the rooms properly, and last minute the administration steps in and withdraws or adds this wild change to the rules of the room booking, which was designed to basically force them out of the space. You have if you look at some of the university campuses, just submitted a story about Concordia. You have this remarkable level of Concordia and McGill go to a court, go to the court to get an injunction to ban all protests anywhere associated with their buildings, which covers a big chunk of downtown Montreal between October 5th and 15th. So the notion was that the students were going to do some threatening demonstrations on the 1 year anniversary of October 7th, and the judge actually grants them the ban. McGill then tries to get that ban basically extended indefinitely. Fortunately, the judge didn't go for that. But even the notion of just banning all protests near the universities for 10 days, as in and of itself, pretty remarkable infringement of our rights. Like I said, I was just doing a story, just submitted a story on Concordia, and they've just innumerable events they banned. They banned the SBHR, the Solidarity for Palestinian Rights, been there for 25 years. McGill as well, banned the group from being an official student club. Many different speaking events. Fired the head of the art gallery for supporting Palestine. Brought in police repeatedly, hired private security, a private security firm set up by a former Israeli soldier who's in charge of security for Federation CJA, the Federation Combined Jewish Appeal here in Montreal. And when asked about this by the student paper about is this Israeli private security company set up by this former Israeli soldier, the response of the PR person from Concordia was, we can assure you none of the former soldiers that have been brought onto campus by this private security company are Israelis. It's only former Canadian soldiers. So they're openly admitting that they're bringing in former soldiers. Concordia already has a huge security apparatus, of course, but they add on these former Canadian soldiers to repress anti-genocide protests. You've seen it down at the level of schools, kids, grade eights, nines, tens being targeted at their schools for raising Palestine. The one where there was a song on Remembrance Day in an Ottawa school that was sort of had actually nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza, but had become kind of it's sort of in Arabic and is sort of associated with peace and had developed some connotations tied to Gaza. And it was played in Remembrance Day, and then all hell broke loose by all these racists and this the notion that there would be any sense of something that could possibly be in sympathy with Palestinians being genocided had no place in our Ottawa public schools. In Toronto, we've seen this in recent days. Right now, yesterday it was, the school board is dealing with this thing. This I guess it's a document affirming Jewish identities and addressing anti-Semitism, which explicitly links anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, and is basically moving towards the Toronto School District School Board considering banning anti-Zionist speech discussion as part of a supposed anti-Semitism strategy, and that's something that we're seeing all over, right? Not a new uh, effort, but this has been ramped up in last 16 months, and this whole business of this goes back to Erwin Kotler and the new anti-Semitism that he said appeared after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. He's been pushing this for 40 plus years. But this it's been formalized and it's been taken on through things like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is basically just an anti-Palestinian definition. And it says that if you say that Israel's a racist endeavor, that's anti-Semitism. But obviously, Israel's a racist endeavor, both historically and what it was in its create. I mean, philosophically, it's a racist. It's Jewish supremacism. That's what it is. In philosophically speaking, but also obviously in practice, that's what it's meant for Palestinians. It's meant their ethnic cleansing, and it's meant apartheid for 75 plus years. But there's this whole like strategy effort to push to adopt the IHRA. Ontario's adopted it, and federal government, Heritage Canada adopted it. It was meaning that people who would get grants from Heritage Canada, many groups get grants for all kinds of, summer projects, all kinds of community, cultural kind of events, concert of some sort, art project of some sort. They have to agree to the Canadian government's anti-racism strategy, which includes the IHRA definition. So this effort to basically label opposition to genocide, opposition to apartheid as anti-Jewish is a big part of the effort to clamp down on protest and activism, and it's formalized to the point where you have a special envoy. This begins, as obviously Erwin Kotler becomes the first special envoy to protect Israel from criticism. The Trudeau agreed to this, I guess it's 4 years ago now. But over the past 16 months, Deborah Lyons took over from Kotler, and Deborah Lyons has made it just absolutely crystal clear. She's paid by our tax dollars, has a staff. And she's made it crystal clear that it's basically just trying to deter protest against Israel, and it's a very powerful stick. This special envoy or the anti-Semitism stick of smacking down protest movement, marginalizing, and at the extreme end, criminalizing these protests, and the criminalization has been formalized, right? So you have a suburb of Toronto, Vaughan, that's brought in these bubble zones, right, where that restrict protests near community and religious institutions. The Ottawa mayor has raised doing that in Ottawa. The Toronto City Council's discussing a resolution for the a bubble zone, and there was a map produced. I believe it was in the Toronto Star. It might have been another outlet where they showed what that would mean if this was actually adopted. And it basically means protest in because it's like you can't protest within 50 or 100 meters of a religious institution, a school, there's a series of things, and it would effectively ban protest in much of the whole city. And this is, Zionist forces have been pushing this very aggressively. They've, pushed it to ban the protests on top of the 401 because they said that the 401, one of the overpasses of the 401 was like near Jewish community, near the Jewish community or heavily Jewish area of Toronto, and Jewish community institutions, even though it was just an overpass of the 401, and that was actually successful. They got the police to really go hard on that. You've had a Montreal judge also agreed to I think it was a 6 month. Well, it was initially a few weeks, and then they got it extended for 3 or 6 months of banning protests at a whole slew. It's like 15 different community Jewish community institutions. But these institutions bring, synagogue that brings former Israeli soldiers or brings former Israeli top officials to come speak. And obviously, it's completely legitimate. In fact, it would be immoral not to protest when a top Israeli official comes and speaks at a house, at a synagogue, at a whatever it may be. But they've been able to do that. And furthermore, in terms of the criminalization, you have, the police with all kinds of raids and targeting of Palestine solidarity. The Toronto police have a whole initiative that's supposed to be about challenging hate crimes. They added millions of dollars, and many police officers ramped up this initiative. I'm actually forgetting the acronym right now. That's basically supposed to be about anti-hate. Well, in practice, what meant is police showing up at Palestine Solidarity, little fundraisers. 30 people attend, and a police officer or a couple of police officers showing up and basically intimidating people. And then you have at a more egregious level, you have the things like the rating of the Indigo people who put up, or not people who put up, people who were alleged to put up a poster. I mean, a poster. Wow, how dangerous and violent. Like I myself, I used to be. I've become an older person, older man with two young kids, but I put up thousands of posters in my more street activist day, and we've put them everywhere. I put them on. I got criminally charged for putting on election signs of Pierre Pettigrew, former foreign minister. But we put them on the windows of metros. We put them on sometimes I think in metros. Put them on inside university buildings. We can debate whether each one of those was right or wrong, but the basic point is putting up a poster is not a big deal. Putting up posters on the window of an Indigo is definitely not a big deal. And to have police basically break down your door early in the morning while you're sleeping with multiple officers to come and raid your home for that alleged crime is absolute criminal overreach by the police, and we've seen that all over. We have just an incident a couple of days ago reported on a Toronto police officer who punched and broke the nose of a Palestine solidarity protester in front of the U.S. Consulate in the summer because another officer, he was holding some sort of placard. Officer kind of went for his placard. He kind of swatted, they say, he swatted the hand away of the police officer that went for his placard. And so another officer just punches him in the nose, breaks his nose, and that's nothing. Nothing happens. SIU that doesn't warrant any sort of charge or any sort of further pursuit. This is a legitimate use of force by the officer. You have things like the RCMP's Industry Response Group, which is got infamous for spying on indigenous and anti-pipeline protests, also spying on Palestine solidarity. You have these things like in Toronto where the police, 6 months later, they charge two individuals for wearing masks to conceal their identity while taking part in a demonstration. 6 months later, that's they seek out someone for two people for these charges. And then they announce that there's no timeline. We can, a year later, you went to some protest. The protest, I don't know, was deemed illegal in some way. We can seek you down a year later for just sort of being somewhere. You see efforts at banning demonstrations in November. Ottawa police went after a number of repeated demonstrations, saying they have to walk on the sidewalk. They have to be on the sidewalk, which is sort of a new rule that was imposed. Arrested a number of people. You see the rating. Maybe one of the more egregious, and maybe Aislin's going to go more into this. More egregious things is the raiding of Charlotte Cates's house. I believe on two occasions in Vancouver, and she was the Sammy Dune. The organizer was Sammy Dune, and that's the most egregious example is the listing of Sammy Dune, Palestine Prisoner Solidarity Network, as a terrorist organization, and this is just a grassroots organization. And then the Zionist groups try to mobilize that. First of all, try to get other groups listed. They pushed hard for Sammy Dune, and then they start to campaign. Well, if you did anything, if you organized in any way associated with Sammy Dune, try to criminalize you. Now you're sort of a terrorist or terrorist supporter. And so the use of the terrorist list to target anti-genocide. Now, I only have very brief little bit here left, but I do want to put a bit of broader historical context, right? The Canadian state has been very repressive against international anti-war type activism, a long time, right? During World War I, you had the War Measures Act, hundreds and hundreds of pacifists arrested. You had groups banned. You had, people like labor organizer Ginger Goodwin killed. There's the massacre in Quebec City where 4 opponents of conscription were killed. During World War II, also you have hundreds of dissidents thrown in jail. The mayor of Montreal, the head of the Canadian Seamen's Union. During the Korean War, you have the targeting of the Canadian Peace Congress, James Endicott, who was targeted by Foreign Minister Pearson, targeted by all kinds of different ways. They ultimately firebomb his home during a Peace Congress meeting. So you have obviously you have formal censorship during those two first wars and quasi-formal in-theater censorship during the Korean War. So there's a long history of targeting anti-war, anti-imperialist, if you want to call it, activism in Canada. And I think what we've seen over the past 16 months is the ramping up of this, I think correctly called McCarthyite kind of climate, targeting those who are just basically demanding that their government, their political culture stop enabling, assisting the unspeakable horrors that Israel's committed against Palestinians in Gaza. I'll leave it at that.
Right on. Thank you so much for that contribution, Yves. That was great. So let's hear now from our second speaker, Aislin Jackson. Aislin attended law school at the University of Toronto, where she was co-editor-in-chief of the Indigenous Law Journal. Aislin started their legal career in the Treaty 7 area, representing First Nations in a variety of areas of law, including historical claims and child protection matters. They later practiced family and estates law in the Lower Mainland, serving legal aid clients and 2S LGBT+ families. Aislin joined the BC Civil Liberties Association as a staff policy counsel in July 2023. Welcome, Aislin.
Yeah, I kind of joined just in time to get a front row seat to a lot of the October 7th and the repression that started happening. I say started happening, but really geared up following it. So since I'm a lawyer, I'm jumping ahead of myself. First, I'm going to situate myself. I am joining this call from the unceded, stolen, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which might be more familiar to English speakers as Vancouver, BC. I am a policy staff lawyer with BCCLA, and that means that I work on everything outside of the courtroom that our organization is involved in on the legal side. Which includes community support. It includes letter writing, making policy submissions, and getting involved in commissions of inquiry and things like that. So that's kind of the scope of what I work on. And our organization in general has been doing a lot of work on Palestinian solidarity expression in the wake of October 7th. Our work didn't start there, though. We, along with other civil society organizations, have been active in militating against the widespread adoption of that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that Yves brought up earlier. That definition is problematic because it conflates political critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. And there was a very lively discussion already happening in Canada before October 7th about the so-called Palestine exception to free expression. So back in 2016, the House of Commons formally condemned BDS, and we published a commentary piece in response to that, raising free expression concerns. There are also a couple of really good reports that came out in 2022 from other organizations. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association did a really informative report on anti-Palestinian racism in Canada. And IJV did Independent Jewish Voices Canada did a very well-researched report about the chill on Palestine solidarity expression in Canada, specifically in academia. That was the focus. So there are some really great resources to draw on when we're addressing the current moment and to help us understand what the state of play was before October 7th. We started seeing an increase in repression of Palestine solidarity expression in the days and weeks that followed October 7th. It was pretty immediate. And so very early on, before the end of October, we felt the need to come out with a published commentary about those efforts and about how important it is to stand to our values and to make sure that our charter is strong in times of conflict and disagreement. So when I talk about the charter, we have a very flexible constitution in Canada. The first part of the charter says that our charter rights are guaranteed subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So I've got that kind of down because I've been listening to it since I was a first-year law student. But what that means is that any limits on our rights have to be reasonable. They have to be set out in the law, so they can't just be an ad hoc decision. It has to be something that has been debated through the political process. And it has to be something that can be demonstrably justified. So not just you can bend, you can kind of squint and see it, but it has to be something that can be justified clearly in a free and democratic society. So that's the test for legal infringement. It has these three prongs, and the last one kind of has multiple prongs. Anyway, all this is lawyerly details we don't necessarily need to know, but because we have this infringement test baked in, the rights themselves cover quite a lot, right? Because there are cases where there can be infringements. And but only in those specific cases. So Section 2 of which is the first part of the charter that gives us any real substantive rights, gives us freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of opinion and expression, including freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of conscience and religion. All that is in Section 2. And there's a real, and those are the rights in a charter context that are really at stake here when we're talking about the criminalization and the persecution of Palestine solidarity expression. So in the months that followed October 7th, we were doing a community support, both public facing and things that aren't public facing at this point, but we wrote multiple public letters on various individual cases, such as on the Peace 11 in Toronto. There was also a case of a protester who was actually charged for saying "from the river to the sea" at a protest in Calgary. Those charges were thankfully withdrawn, but that was very alarming. That happened in November of not last year, but the year prior. And then so we were working on these individual cases of repression while the protest movement on campuses was building and building, and the threat from universities who were upset with the disruption that this protest activity caused was also building. So in May of last year, in early May, I wrote an open letter to every university president in Canada, urging them to prioritize free expression of their students and refrain from taking any forceful, carceral, policing-based actions against their students. That kind of had a mixed success. We saw as the summer developed, there were a variety of court actions, including one, Yves mentioned the McGill case. There was also one right here out in BC where Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo went to court to look for what's called an injunction against their student protest encampment. Now, what an injunction is it's a court order basically telling somebody not to do something. It's the court saying don't. And in this case, as with essentially all of the university cases, the fundamental basis for this injunction is we own the property. So they were really setting it up as a property rights versus free expression situation. And universities have a sort of interesting status under the charter because they have some public funding, but they also govern themselves. They're not, so are they governmental entities that we have charter remedies against, or aren't they? There are different cases in different provinces that say different things, right? So we have a question mark over this at the federal level now, that we just don't have a clear answer on it. So that was an interesting case. Ultimately, the court ended up granting an injunction, but they scaled it back from what the university had asked for in the first place, and they left the door open for the law to continue to evolve in the future to prioritize free expression rights a little bit more highly. They just didn't adopt our submissions that the free expression rights really should outweigh the private property rights in this case. That was in August of last year. And then last November, these are sort of some highlights I'm pulling out. My colleague Ga Grant presented to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage as part of its study on the protection of free expression in Canada, and raised as the two biggest threats that we saw from our organization to free expression in Canada as being suppression of Indigenous land defenders and suppression of Palestine solidarity expression. So we are continuing to work on a variety of community support cases. I completely forgot another big highlight. There was a very major protest activity that was a rails blockade in East Vancouver. And the police response to that was extreme and included reported police brutality against a pregnant attendee, as well as some putting out a sacred fire that was being kept by Indigenous firekeepers, and just a high degree of violence. So we, together with Pivot Legal Society, which is a wonderful legal org that operates out of the downtown east side, close to where our offices are, we have collaborated to file police complaints, not only about the police brutality that's reported at the rails blockade last year, but also about the surveillance of Palestine solidarity activists in Vancouver more generally, as well as some cases where police officers who were engaged in policing Palestine solidarity protests were seen with Israel flag patches on their uniforms, which obviously was inflammatory and did nothing to de-escalate the situation. So we have these, we're moving on these various legal fronts. We are trying to make sure that people's rights are actually protected, because the charter is not self-enforcing. We have to actually get out there and assert our rights and make these arguments and put it in front of the courts in order to get any sort of, in order to breathe life into the Constitution. One of the really interesting developments that I didn't hear Yves mention, that is very recent, that I want to make sure everyone's aware of, is that Birju Datani, who last year had been appointed the Canadian Human Rights Commissioner, and then was subject to a smear campaign from CIJA and Ezra Levant and others, saying that he was a terrorist sympathizer, calling him, smearing him as an anti-Semite, essentially, to the point where he actually stepped down before he, as the Human Rights Commissioner of Canada, before he had an opportunity to do anything in the office at all. And at the beginning of this month, he announced that he was suing CIJA, Ezra Levant, and at least one Conservative MP for defamation because of what they had said about him, in order to hound him out of office. And we'll be keeping an eye on that case as it develops, because it should be very interesting to see what comes out in evidence and what the court says about that. I don't want to comment too much on Charlotte Cates in particular. And I'm trying to do that in general about individual cases, because sometimes we have information that isn't public and I don't want to blur any lines. But one thing that I will mention is that that's an example of something that really concerns us, which is she was arrested and was not charged, because police in BC don't lay charges. They recommend charges to the Crown Prosecution Service, who actually makes the charging decision. It's a little bit different than in Ontario, where, for example, where the police would lay the charges themselves and then the Crown could decide to discontinue later. But so she was arrested, she was released. She was not charged of any crime at this point, but she was subject to conditions of release that they made her agree to before they left, that prohibited her from being involved in protest. And that's really concerning, not just, I mean, it's all concerning whenever someone is prohibited from protest, but this didn't even get in front of a court. She didn't even have an opportunity to make submissions to a court about what the impact would be on her free expression. In the last couple of minutes here, I just want to echo the comments about the terrorism list. And now we're seeing this being pulled into service, I suppose we could say, in the Canada-US trade dispute as well, because we're apparently designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations to to make our US counterparts more comfortable or something. But it just underscores the point that this terrorism list is a politically defined list that's used as a way to short circuit people's due process rights. And that's a big problem, and it's a problem that isn't just confined to the Palestine solidarity case, but it certainly has a differential impact on people who are perceived to be Arab or Muslim. Terrorism has been used in North American culture for quite a while as a slur against people who are Arab or Muslim. And I think that needs to be part of what we consider when we consider the repression of Palestine solidarity expression in Canada in general. So that was everything I wanted to make sure I touched on. And I suppose that this is as good a time as any to open the floor to questions. But I'll pass back to our moderator just to keep everything tidy.
Right on. Thank you, Aislin. That was super informative. Yeah, you're right. We're at question and answer time. So any questions, please throw them in the chat or raise your hand. Thanks for the information. Is there any evidence of CSIS or Mossad targeting Palestine solidarity activists on Canadian soil for assassination or violence? Oh my. Good to know. Hans, I'll take your question. If can, right.
We've been on the back foot of this new McCarthyism, this Cold War II, largely because of Putin's mistake of invading Ukraine, however provoked he was to do so. Today's news is quite astounding. You have the much maligned Pete Hesketh announcing that the Trump administration is abandoning the prospect of membership in NATO for Ukraine, and at the same time recognize that the territorial boundaries established by this war are pretty well irreversible. This has completely upended the pro-war lobby meeting right now in Munich. And no doubt it'll have repercussions here, probably in the form of the Freeland campaign. Or at least let's hope we can make something out of that. So I'm asking the panelists, what impact do you think this shift in American policy, leading likely to a ceasefire in Ukraine and the dampening down of the lies that underlie the justifications for that war, what impact will that have on the political climate in Canada, along with the embattled outrageous demands of Trump of annexing Canada, etc. But specifically, I want to focus on this event today.
Okay, thank you for that question, Hans. So I think we'll just leave it with those two questions for now, because those are quite could be a lot to them. So we'll leave it with Hans' question about the Ukraine events in Ukraine, how that might be impacting things, and whether there's been any evidence of CSIS or Mossad activity on Canadian soil. And we'll go to Yves first and then back to Aislin. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, the first with the CSIS stuff. Now, I'm not familiar with CSIS, Mossad, or Mossad specifically assassinating in Canada. What we know is that Mossad has long used Canadian passports for its assassinations. A mistakenly killed in, I think it's in Oslo, I forget, 1982-ish, something like that. They thought someone was some Palestinian they were trying to target. random Arab in Oslo, killed him. Canadian passport. The most well-known one, which became a diplomatic spat, was the poisoning of Khalid Mashal in, is it? I think it's 96 in Jordan, and they catch the agents, Israeli agents, and they force them to provide the antidote to the poisoning. So this, I mean, this is right out of like a movie, right? And they were on Canadian passports. Now, I quote in my Canada Israel book, I quote some officials saying basically Canadian diplomats, CSIS turned a blind eye to this. They knew the Israelis were using Canadian passports. The Canadian passports were sort of for whatever exact. I don't know the full reason. I mean, a Canadian passport is generally a pretty good passport to get into different places. But so yeah, so there was basically this kind of. I have never seen evidence that the Mossad's doing that in Canada, but that there is this sort of connection between Canada and Mossad hits internationally. Now, we do know that CSIS has regularly targeted Palestine solidarity. I have two friends here in Montreal, Stefan Christoph, who I wrote about this 10, 12 years ago. After he goes to the West Bank, he is all kinds of things. Start going talking to all his different people, friends of his, and I think it's like a half dozen different individuals. He was, one of the more sort of prominent Palestine solidarity activists um, uh, uh, that in 2010, 2008, 2012 kind of period. And in Montreal. And Frida Gutman also, she was also a well-known Palestine solidarity person. She got targeted. So there's no doubt that CSIS and there's I quote this also in the Canada Israel book. There's the communication security establishment, which is Canada's NSA, part of the Five Eyes. It regularly had Palestinian officials on its list of names to back. This is earlier technological days, to target. And so yeah, so CSIS is definitely working with Mossad. We know that, and sharing intelligence. And Snowden talked about that in the NSA things about the Five Eyes and ties to Israel. Uh, um with regards to Ukraine, that's definitely an interesting development. My just a quick, I broadly am supportive of Trump's move in this direction. I'm so hostile to what Donald Trump has done on obviously in so many different issues, from climate to specifically the Gaza stuff in the last few weeks of his at least rhetorically. I mean, initially his pushing Israel to do the ceasefire was a good thing, but all the rhetoric that's come out of him in the past couple of weeks, that the sort of anger on that has, I though I'm happy on the Ukraine thing. No, I do. I think it's big. I mean, if you look at Chrystia Freeland specifically, she right away said no, Ukraine will join NATO. And then I just saw a tweet she put out a couple hours ago saying, if I'm prime minister, Russia will never be back at the G7 type thing. So she's obviously very angry at these moves from the Trump administration. What's the going to be the big picture geopolitics of this? I just saw that the head of NATO is basically saying, "Oh no, we never promised that Ukraine would join NATO if there's a peace agreement." So he's already trying to align his rhetoric with what's coming out of Trump and his military chief. So yeah, I don't know where this what this all means. I don't think that at the end of the day, I don't think the NATO proxy war is that important to the U.S. empire. I think the U.S. empire can walk away, and it's not that much different than walking away from Afghanistan. I mean, it's different. There's bigger politics at play than that, but they can walk away, and it doesn't matter if Russia controls 20% of what was pre-2014 Ukrainian territory, if it controls 15% or if it controls 25%. That's not of ultimately that great import to US. It's a bigger problem. The other European countries that have totally subordinated themselves to Washington's politics, foreign policy, and have, undermined their own economies and all that. There, it's a bigger issue for them. How they're going to try to get out of this. Obviously, we live in a country that's been one of the most sort of pro proxy war, and
Wrap up when you can, please, Yves.
yeah, so that's gonna, shape Canadian foreign policy and some of the discussion. But I also think that can be, just we can move along. It's not fundamental to Canada to continue with the horrible war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I bet Christopher Freeland's having a bad week, but I'm okay with that on that side. Ashlyn, to you to answer the questions for 5 minutes as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I will end up using all 5 of my minutes because I'm not really a foreign policy buff myself, and I don't want to get out too far past my skis. One thing I will say is I haven't seen any evidence that that CSIS or indeed Mossad would be targeting domestic is the Palestine solidarity activists, but I also would not expect to see evidence if it existed at this point. With the levers that we have to get information about the government are through access to information and FOIA requests, and all of those statutes have huge carve outs for anything that touches on national security. So I would expect that even journalists trying to get that information out of the government would not be able to access it at this time. Maybe we'll find out sometime in the future that had been going on, but yeah, even if it is going on, I wouldn't expect that we would know about it.
Right, very good points. Okay, we can move on to next set of questions. Feel free to throw your hand up or put it in chat. I can read it out. So I'll read out Tina's question, which is kind of related to my question and jumping off what you were just saying as well, Ashlyn. So Tina's asking, how do we combat criminality against Palestinian solidarity and encroachment of our rights? And this is kind of going along with my question as well. The last time we had Ashlyn on a webcast here, it was for talking about the Online Harms Act. And Yves has been bringing up more surveillance state, encroachment and things like that. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of connection there. Has there been progress? I mean, I know back a few months ago, I was like, well, what does this mean for us activists now? And we've only seen since then further repression of our speech. And also the public-private partnership and the kind of jurisdictional issues with access to information and everything that you're bringing up there as well, Ashlyn, I think is really interesting. Because it just really makes central that piece of like the information piece, right? And the fact that there is a carve out for everything, it seems like when it's national security, terrorism, national security, all of a sudden the charter like means nothing. You don't have legal rights. So, as an activist, I'm thinking, how does this affect how we should respond? And, that's an open question, and comrades and folks here welcome to chime in with any comments as well. But yeah, I like to get your thoughts on that. It's all kind of three questions rolled up into one, but how do we combat this criminality against Palestinian solidarity and encroachment, given our context of increased surveillance state in Canada, and the kind of jurisdictional things we have to wade through with how so many of our institutions are structured as these like public-private partnerships. How does that it seems like that's relevant to how they actually show up in suppressing our speech as citizens and stuff like that. So that was kind of long and rambly, so I'll leave it out there, and we're going to Ashlyn first and then to Yves.
Yeah, so well, I think my My director of engagement, who does fundraising, would be cross with me if I didn't at least mention that you could consider becoming a member of the BCCLA and supporting our work that way. But I think community organizing and providing local support to one another is really important. People who have already been criminalized, like it takes a long time for those processes to run their course. So people who are facing charges, people who are facing employment consequences, those kind of things can use especially local support. Things like jail support or attending court with people can be tremendously impactful for those individuals and make them feel like they are in community and they're not going it alone. That can be a really big help. So make those connections, keep them strong, look out for people's legal defense funds can be really helpful. Yeah, and just don't take your eye off this ball, because I suspect that in the time of the second Trump presidency, we're going to be getting news hot and fast. Lots and lots of new horrors for us to turn our attention to. And we shouldn't let this fall off of our priorities list. We need to continue to show up for the members of our community who have already been criminalized for their Palestine solidarity expression, and we need to keep our eye on this ball.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aislin.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree. That's the main thing, is to keep going, not let it deter us from taking action. Obviously, there's like innumerable different forms of support, from, writing, email campaigns in response to Samidun being put on the terrorist list, to, articles about it, to, statements to, get behind it. Don't let it instill fear and deter people from, associating with the, grassroots group that's been doing great stuff. Um, so, and then, from the campus level the administration shuts down events and try to make as big of a kerfuffle about it, to make it difficult for them to do it the next time, to you see it really concretely. I mean, with like Montreal police over the past decades of participating in hundreds and hundreds of demonstrations. I've seen the ebb and flow with the Montreal police, and if you now it's basically the point where they actually let the protests march against traffic, so we can go on St. Catherine Street against traffic. They won't usually let you go for like, and this is with they saw this last weekend, another weekend before last, with the truck. And I remember, like, the struggles around doing student demonstrations during the student strike in 2012 is by asserting the right to take space, the police then just figure it out, right? They then, organize stopping traffic based upon what protesters are asserting. And there's some give, and there's different types of demonstrations that are organized with different, relationships vis-a-vis the police, and that's up to different organizers to get into those kind of questions. But the important point here is that we have to be bold in that this is whatever little issue about traffic is far superseded by our need to participate in the democratic process, and then maybe more specifically to stop our government's complicity in a genocide. So there's, it's about, I think, being bold, being clear. Now, on this issue, there is an element that we have to talk about specifically, which is the anti-Semitism stick. And it is I would say, a somewhat unique element of here you have a situation where you have the U.S. empire backing Zionism, Israel. You have these well-organized, well-financed, mostly Jewish pro-Israel groups. And then you have a ability to play victim. it's a kind of a unique dynamic, and like the anti-Semitism envoy, and people have obviously become more willing to either ignore the anti-Semitism allegations or mock them or just keep fight through them. But I think we have to understand that that is actually quite important in deterring people, specifically people in sort of people, I don't know, some Toronto Star reporters and people sort of like liberalish kind of intellectual world people who know that Israel's doing horrible things. They know that Palestinians have been long mistreated, but they're really scared of being labeled anti-Semitic or being sort of targeted in that way. So it is important to I think be bold again in responding to what can be often somewhat kind of uncomfortable kind of conversations and dynamics on that front.
Totally. All right, we're past an hour here. Thank you, Yves. I see another question in the chat from Tom. So I think we'll do the last round. If anyone has another question, throw it out now. I'll read out Tom's question, and I have one final question, of course. Okay, so Tom writes, pro-Zionist politicians try to characterize defenders of Palestinian human rights as being anti-Semitic and fomenting hate. Do you think it's time to push back and call out the hate mongers like Melissa Lantsman? Basically, go on the offensive and keep these Zionist politicians out of our schools, political parties, and cities. Hear, hear, Tom. Yes, I think that's a good idea. And my final question on top of that is, I'm just kind of interested. I was hearing Aislin talk about these cases and Yves too, and I'm curious how much of them actually end up going to like conviction and jail, right? A lot of them, it seems like there's just kind of intimidation and lawfare at the beginning, and then that's kind of the point. Which again, if that's more common, or at least has been more common tactic so far, would inform probably how I respond or think about the types of institutional attacks that we might be facing as activists. So I'll throw those two questions out, and this time we're going to Aislin first, and then Yves.
Yeah, so I think it's a good many of the cases we were familiar with, there didn't end up actually being charges brought or the charges were dismissed upon reflection. Because although we do have, what are commonly called hate speech, but more technically are hate propaganda offenses in the criminal code, they're a pretty high bar. It's like the stuff that police are thinking is going to be, oh yeah, this is a hate crime prosecution. Not prosecutors who have gone to law school are a little bit like, no, I don't think it actually is in many of the cases. But as far as I'm aware, some of the Peace 11 in Toronto are still facing charges, and it does take quite a bit of time for the criminal process to work its way through, right? So I don't think we're going to have a complete picture of how many people actually had to go to trial, for instance, on these kind of on charges related to Palestine solidarity expression. I don't think we're going to have a complete picture for another year or two, perhaps. There's a case in Canada called Jordan from the Supreme Court of Canada that basically sets an 18-month deadline to have a trial after charges are laid. But there are exceptions to that. So if the defense is causing a delay, for example, that doesn't count. So it can take even a couple of years for something to actually come to trial, partially because of we have an underfunded justice system. We don't have enough judges. So there's quite a bit of delay in actually booking the time you need for the trial. But there's a lot that lawyers have to do to prepare for these. There's disclosure that has to be exchanged. There are preliminary motions that have to be heard. So Yeah, I'm not sure that we can answer that yet. I think it's going to become clear in the next couple of years what the effect actually is.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I've heard a number of things been dropped. I know lawyer Shane Martinez got a couple of the terror supporting charges. People had, I think it was a Hezbollah flag. It was a PFL, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine flag, and Toronto police charged them, and he got it dropped. They never moved forward, but it was like 3 or 4 months. And then the Toronto police went and did it, followed it by doing it again, just a way to kind of harass people, kind of hype up the fact that they're like, uh, these are terrorist supporting demonstrations, and kind of fit into that whole thing. I also know there's a story about someone with the activists. I'm blanking on a name right now. I interviewed about the in the Giller Prize stuff, and one of the people that they arrested, they had these pretty significant conditions, and it was just like dropped. And apparently, how does this go? The Crown drops things, but like they had decided this 6 months earlier, but they waited till after the 1 year anniversary of the Giller whatever the show or whatever, and award ceremony, I guess, and so basically the person was restricted from like protest or whatever, and they just wait till after it's done to tell them that this has actually been dropped like 6 months ago or 4 months ago or whatever. So that pretty crass kind of use of the legal system to even restrict rights, and even when someone's not actually going to go to jail or any found guilty of anything. Yeah, in terms of the anti-Semitism stuff, I think we have to be clear that like Deborah Lyons, who was when she was Canadian ambassador to Israel, she hosted a pizza party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. I mean, that's what gets you to become the special envoy to for is it official names combat or to promote Holocaust remembrance and combat anti-Semitism, something like that. I mean, she's a special envoy to promote a Holocaust. That's what she is. And we should be clear about that. And she's acted that way the whole way she's been in that position. She is being paid by the public to promote the horrors that Israel's committing in Gaza. And we need to be absolutely clear about that, and just they've made it to the point where anti-Semitism, as that T-shirt from the South Africa Palestine people point out, if you haven't been called an anti-Semite, you haven't done enough for justice yet today, or something to that effect, right? We have to, that's just the reality of anti-Semitism in for much of the certainly the Israel lobby. It's not the richest man in the world doing a Seg Hitler Nazi salute at a event that's millions of people are watching. It's someone wearing a watermelon symbol, right? And we have to state that really clearly, and yeah.
Absolutely. Be bold and hope and expect that justice prevails, I guess. We got to keep going until it does, right? I think we say that a lot on these webcasts. What other choice do we have? So, folks, that'll be wrapping it up for today. If you like what you've heard, please consider joining Socialist Action. Visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca or call 647-986-1917 to sign up or find out more information about our events and materials, such as the monthly publication, the Red Review Journal. You can also find this information in the caption below the video. Thanks very much to Yves Engler and Aislin Jackson for their presentations, and thanks to everyone involved in making this webcast today. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, March 6th, in celebration of International Women's Day. See you there, and take care, everyone.